Over the 6 decades that the Rolling Stones have been active, they've crossed societal, cultural, and musical frontiers, all while maintaining their popularity in the industry and all around the world. They impacted the transition of old blues into classic rock and roll in the early 60s and helped bring anti establishment ideas to the forefront of mainstream society. The Stones serve as an inspiration to many modern day rock stars and shape the way artists and celebrities are viewed today. After years of Elvis and other homegrown rock and roll pioneers, American music fans were ready for innovation and change, which paved the way for British rock musicians to rise to fame in the 1960s. America was changing its standards of music and fashion as it started to appeal to the younger generation instead of aiming for the more mature and elite members of society. In 1964, the British invasion arrived in the form of the Beatles, which signified the success of British culture within American consumerism and had a great impact on the UK economy. This impact was felt in the form of their economic growth, translating into rising living standards and more British households being able to purchase a greater range of white goods and cars. The influence of the British was usually seen as a positive change, as long as it didn't disturb American politics or the leading domestic industries. An example of this was the huge increase in U.S. payrolls made by President Kennedy, which was the highest growth in jobs by far in any decade during the post war period. Although this was an overall big event, the short lived invasion had a minor impact on the big picture issues of the day compared to the protests happening all around America, which included the civil rights movement, the student movement, the women's movement, the gay rights movement, the environmental movement, and the anti Vietnam War movement. Back in Europe, the post-World War II world created a distinctive and international gap in between the older and younger generations known as the generation gap. Youth's new roles and lifestyles created a subculture that was rooted in fashions and musical tastes that separated them from their elders. American rock and roll and jazz spread like wildfire throughout Western Europe, and this rise was only aided by the invention of the LP, the long playing record album played on vinyl. Youths also played a key role in the ongoing consumer revolution. More manufacturers made advertisements and products that consciously targeted the youth market because they recognized that the young people, now called teenagers, had money to spend due to post war prosperity. This new culture became an assured part of Western society. A clear sign that this was happening was the rapid growth in the number of universities and college students. By 1960, at least 3 times more European students attended some kind of university than they had before World War II. Although this rise was happening, many students felt like they were not getting the kind of education they needed for jobs in the modern world. At the same time, some reflective students feared that the universities were doing nothing but turning out docile technocrats, both to stock and to serve the establishment. It was no surprise that these certain students became leaders in a counterculture that aimed and attacked the ideals of the affluent society of the post-war world. After both growing up in London together, Keith Richards and Mick Jagger rekindled their friendship that started in elementary school when they ran into each other at a train station in 1960. The two aspiring musicians decided they wanted to make their own music by experimenting with instruments and writing rhythm and blues mixed with rock and roll. They soon joined with future members Brian Jones, Charlie Watts, and Bill Wyman to create an upcoming band by the name of the Rolling Stones, a name inspired by the 1950 Muddy Waters track Rollin' Stones. After seeing the success of the Beatles in America and around the world, the Stones decided to try this so-called rock star life for themselves. They played their first concert at the Marquee Club in London on July 12, 1962, and began bringing in younger audiences who were looking for something new and exciting. In 1963, the Stones signed with an English record producer and manager named Andrew Oldham, who envisioned the Stones as the anti-Beatles and took a chance by deciding to promote their bad boy image to the press. That same year, the Stones cut their first single, a cover of Chuck Berry's Come On, which hit number 21 on the UK singles chart. At first, the press turned an eye toward the Rolling Stones, who were seen as a group of brash punks, upsetting the status quo by playing black music to white audiences. A March 1964 article in the British Weekly titled, "Would You Let Your Sister Go with a Stone?" created such a stir that 8,000 kids showed up to the Stones' next gig. Eventually, the Stones' fame grew so much that they started their first tour to America in June of 1964. They started to perform in front of larger audiences and found a recording studio by the name of Chess Studios in Chicago. In these studios, they were able to capture the vibrant and earthy sound they desired due to better acoustics. Their success continued to reach new height, and when 1965 rolled around, the Stones released their first original single, I Can't Get No Satisfaction, which immediately became a mega hit and went number 1 worldwide. In this single, people got a first-class seat to the Rolling Stones' musical attitude, a mixture of rebellion and irreverence, using urgent guitars, tribal drums, forceful harmonicas, and animalistic, sexually tense vocals. By 1967, the members of the Rolling Stones were officially living like rock stars. Unfortunately, their multi-instrumentalist Brian Jones struggled the most with drugs and mental health and quit the band. Just a few weeks later, Jones was tragically found dead in his swimming pool. By the late 1960s, the Stones had officially become the bad boys they had once promoted themselves to be. Mick Jagger, an ultimate frontman, also put effort into his fashion and was never afraid to be bold. Their concerts became filled with teenagers from the growing counterculture movement and were harsh enough to lead to a number of complaints against the Stones for causing concert violence. By the early 1970s, the Stones were a very controversial group. They fired their manager Alan Klein, who had taken over from Oldham in 1966, and had an idea to start their own record label, Rolling Stones Records. The Stones continued to write and record music, mixing in punk and disco genres inspired by new band member Ronnie Wood. By the end of the 1970s, the Beatles had broken up, Jimi Hendrix was dead, and Led Zeppelin had barely appeared on the horizon. Best said by Britannica, they were an incendiary blend of sex, drugs, Satanism, and radical politics delivered with their signature fusion of Jagger's explosive stage presence and Richard's rugged intensity. Their records and concerts during this time both explored and provided the soundtrack for the contradictions of a collapsing counterculture, the fall of a cleaner, more socially conservative world. At a time when almost everyone else, groups including The Doors, The Velvet Underground, and Frank Zappa's Mothers of Invention, still seemed to be in a state of psychedelic euphoria, creating a softer and more basic form of music that seemed to be stuck in the past. During the early 80s, the band experimented with the new wave genre, but the members had the desire to start to pursue solo careers due to creative differences between them. But by the late 80s, the band realized they were stronger together, after experiencing the death of their longtime keyboardist, Ian Stewart, who passed away in 1985 due to a fatal heart attack. Over the decades, the Rolling Stones have endured chart-topping popularity, and while the band members might be in their 60s and 70s now, they continue to record, perform, and tour today. Not only did the Stones shift blues into rock and roll, they also generated a new and exciting way of performing that musicians such as Arctic Monkeys, Greta Van Fleet, and Måneskin still continue till this day. In addition to their performances, the Stones carried a unique punk lifestyle and look with them their whole career. The Rolling Stones also inspired the name of the famous music magazine, The Rolling Stone. Joe Elliott, lead singer of Def Leppard, once said, "That's why 60,000 people go ape when the Stones play Satisfaction. The songs are part of their legacy, and you fall back in love with them over the years." With their careers still thriving even today, it's obvious the impact that the Rolling Stones had on society and the future as they knew it. Their creative ideas helped turn the 50s blues into what is now known as classic 60s and 70s rock and roll, all while breaking down the frontiers of the clean boy-next-door looks and the softer, more subtle musical pieces, and introduced society to a world with riskier fashion, edgier attitudes, and dark instrumentals that changed the course of the music industry and history as we know it.